Henry George did Devotional episode 46, chapter 6, Wages and the Law of Wages, of book 3, The Laws of Distribution. We will read half of this chapter. I actually looked ahead and decided this chapter is too big to do on its own. George writes, "We have, by inference, already obtained the law of wages. But to verify the deduction and to strip the subject of all ambiguities, let us seek the law from an independent starting point. We're going to check our work. There is, of course, no such thing as a common rate of wages, in the sense that there is at any given time and place a common rate of interest. Wages, which include all returns received from labor, not only vary with the varying powers of individuals, but as the organization of society becomes elaborate, vary largely as between occupations. Nevertheless, there is a certain general relation between all wages, so that we express a clear and well understood idea when we say that wages are higher or lower in one time or place than in another. In their degrees, wages rise and fall in obedience to a common law. What is this law?" Yes, that's the nature of speaking generally. "The fundamental principle of human action, the law that is to political economy what the law of gravitation is to physics, is that men seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion." This is not the first time nor the last time we'll hear George say that. George continues, "Evidently, this principle must bring to an equality through the competition it induces, the reward gained by equal exertions under similar circumstances. When men work for themselves, this equalization will be largely affected by the equation." Excuse me. This equalization will be largely affected by the equation of prices, and between those who work for themselves and those who work for others, the same tendency to equalization will operate. Now, under this principle, what, in conditions of freedom, will be the terms at which one man can hire others to work for him? Evidently, they will be fixed by what the men could make if laboring for themselves. The principle which will prevent him from having to give anything above this except what is necessary to induce the change, will also prevent them from taking less. Did they demand more, the competition of others would prevent them from getting employment. Did he offer less, none would accept the terms, as they could obtain greater results by working for themselves. Thus, oh man, yawning, sneezing, struggle. Thus, although the employer wishes to pay as little as possible and the employee to receive as much as possible, wages will be fixed by the value or produce of such labor to the laborers themselves. If wages are temporarily carried either above or below this line, a tendency to carry them back at once arises. But the result or the earnings of labor, as is readily seen in those, I know people here could complain a lot about workers not getting their true fair compensation, or women not getting the same compensation as men, or racial minorities perhaps. Lots of discussion there. The relevant George's perspective would be that just about no worker anywhere is getting their full compensation, given that most of wages are, well, I think George is just about to explain this. So let's let George keep going. And then you'll know the Georgist view. But the result or the earnings of labor, as is readily seen in those primary and fundamental occupations in which labor first engages and which, even in the most highly developed condition of society, still form the base of production, does not depend merely upon the intensity or quality of the labor itself. Yes, he's going to talk a lot about these base of production jobs. Wealth is the product of two factors, land and labor. And what a given amount of and remember, capital is just stored up labor. And what a given amount of labor will yield will vary with the powers of the natural opportunities to which it is applied. This being the case, The principle that men seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion, see, I told you we'd hear this again, will fix wages at the produce of such labor at the point of highest natural productiveness open to it. Now, by virtue of the same principle, the highest point of natural productiveness open to labor under existing conditions will be the lowest point at which production continues. For men, impelled by a supreme law of the human mind to seek the satisfaction of their desires with the least exertion, see, we heard about it again, will not expend labor at a lower point of productiveness while a higher is open to them. Thus, yeah, George doesn't care much about, oh, you'll do what you love because it pays, even though it pays less. Um, yeah, you just bundle that into satisfying your desires. Uh, yeah. George says, thus the wages which an employer must pay will be measured by the lowest point of natural productiveness to which production extends. And wages will rise or fall as this point rises or falls. To illustrate, in a simple state of society, each man, as is the primitive mode, works for himself, some in hunting, let us say, some in fishing, some in cultivating the ground. Cultivation, we will suppose, has just begun, and the land in use is all of the same quality, yielding a similar return to similar exertions. Wages, therefore, for though there is neither employer nor employed, there are yet wages, wages being the return to labor, will be the full produce of the land. And making allowance for the difference of agreeableness, risk, etc., in the three pursuits, they will be on the average equal in such, that is to say, equal exertions will yield equal results. Because we're saying the land is all of the same quality. That is, now, if one of their number wishes to employ some of his fellows to work for him instead of for themselves, he must pay wages fixed for this by full average produce of labor. Yeah, he wouldn't make really any money off them. Let a period of time elapse. Cultivation has extended, and instead of land of the same quality, embraces lands of different qualities. Wages will not be as before. The average produce of labor, wages now will not be as before the average produce of labor. They will be the average produce of labor at the margin of cultivation, otherwise known as the point of lowest return. For as men seek to satisfy their desires with the least possible exertion, the point of lowest return in cultivation must yield to labor a return equivalent to the average return in hunting and fishing. The equalization will be affected by the equation of prices. This is assuming that hunting and fishing are not yet impacted by overfishing or overhunting or good hunting lands, and yeah, I don't know. Labor will no longer yield equal returns to equal exertions, but those who expend their labor on the superior land will obtain a greater produce for the same exertion than those who cultivate the inferior land. Wages, however, will still be equal, for this excess which the cultivators of the superior land receive is in reality rent. And if land has been subjected, yes, because by our definition, it's rent is how much a piece of land with the same labor. If you take the cheapest, freest land, the cheapest land that is free, you apply labor to that, you get X out of it. And then you take any other land and you apply labor, the same amount of labor to that, you're going to get X plus Y, and that Y amount is the rent. It is the return above what the return is on the marginal land. Wages, yes, because is in reality rent, and if land has been subjected to individual ownership, will give it a value. Yes, so if somebody owns the land, then that will be known. It will be, yes. All right. Maybe not owns, yeah, individual ownership. Now, if under these changed circumstances, one member of this community wishes to hire others to work for him, he will have to pay only what the labor yields at the lowest point of cultivation. If, therefore, the margin of cultivation sinks to points of lower and lower productiveness, so must wages sink. Bum, bum, bum. If, on the contrary, it rises, so also must wages rise. For, as a free body tends to make the shortest route to earth's center, so do men seek the easiest mode to the gratification of their desires. If you didn't pick up on that, a free body tending to take the shortest route to the earth's center is another way of describing gravity, at least in the within the Earth's the space that the Earth dominates as the largest mass. All right, George continues. Here then we have the law of wages as a deduction from a principle more obvious and most universal, that wages depend upon the margin of cultivation, that they will be greater or less as the produce which labor can obtain from the highest natural opportunities open to it is greater or less, flows from the principle that men will seek to satisfy their wants with the least exertion. I don't think we really made it fully halfway, but it sure seems like a good stopping point. Let's see. George says, now if we turn from simple social states to the complex phenomena of highly civilized societies, we shall find upon examination that they also fall under this law. In such societies, wages differ widely, but they still bear a more or less definite and obvious relation to each other. This relation is not invariable, as at one time a philosopher of repute may earn by his lectures manyfold the wages of the best mechanic, and at another can hardly hope for the pay of a footman. As in a great city, occupations may yield relatively high wages, which, in a new settlement, would yield relatively low wages. Yet these variations between wages may, under all conditions and in spite of arbitrary divergences caused by custom law, etc., be traced to certain circumstances. In one of his most interesting chapters, Adam Smith thus enumerates the principle of circumstances which make up for a small pecuniary gain in some employments and counterbalance a great one in others. First, the agreeableness or disagreeableness of the employments themselves. Secondly, yes, that's what I was saying. Doing what you love, you'll take less compensation. Uh, George calls that agreeableness. Secondly, the easiness and cheapness or the difficulty and expense of learning them. Thirdly, the constancy or inconstancy of employment in them. This would sort of be distinct from kind of the risk. It'd be like something like you only need to harvest in the fall and sow in the spring, or Target only needs workers. Our Target needs a whole bunch of extra workers around Christmas. And then fifthly, do we do fourthly? Fourthly, the small or great trust must be reposed in those who exercise them, responsibility. And fifthly, the probability or improbability of success in them. All right, there is the risk, which, the last, which is analogous to the element of risk in profits, accounts for the high wages of successful lawyers, physicians, contractors, actors, etc. Huh. I wouldn't have thought so much about lawyers and physicians. I mean, I know if you can, try to be a lawyer, most of them will fail, so there's a risk in spending your time pursuing it, and that's like compensated on the whole by being the few that are successful. I suppose That is true. I don't know how many people try to become lawyers and physicians and actually fail. If that's, I don't think that's nearly like as high a rate as actors. Contract. I don't know. I mean, I don't think he means. I don't know. It is not necessary to dwell in detail. I mean, I do know a lot of. I've heard a lot of lawyers actually don't do very well, and maybe we have, yeah. Whereas right now we have artificially decreased the number of doctors. So everyone who's a doctor had to compete a lot to get like a residency, I guess, matched. And the like American board American Medical Association like limits the number of residencies available each year. So we have a dearth of doctors. Because that's what the American Medical Board thought was best for America to have. I don't know why they would think that. Other than to make all of their doctors rich. Speaking as the son of a doctor who has benefited. Let us continue. Um, it is not necessary to dwell in detail on these causes of variation in wages between different employments. They have been admirably explained and illustrated by Adam Smith and the economists who have followed him, who have well worked out the details even if they have failed to apprehend the main law. Alright, now do we feel like we've done a good halfway job of this chapter? I still don't think we've even made it halfway. But it's also a good ending point. We rederived one more paragraph. I hear everyone crying out. The effect of all the circumstances which give rise to the differences between wages and in different occupations may be included as supply and demand, and it is perfectly correct to say that the wages in different occupations will vary relatively according to differences in the supply and demand of labor, meaning by demand the call which the community as a whole makes for services of the particular kind, and by supply the relative amount of labor which, under the existing conditions, can be determined to the performance of those particular services. But though this is true as to the relative differences of wages, when it is said, as is commonly said, that the general rate of wages is determined by supply and demand, the words are meaningless, for supply and demand are but relative terms. The supply of labor can only mean labor offered in exchange for labor or the produce of labor, and the demand for labor can only mean labor or the produce of labor offered in exchange for labor. Supply is thus demand, and demand supply, and in the whole community one must be co-extensive with the other. This is clearly apprehended by the current political economy in relation to sales, and the reasoning of Ricardo, Mill, and others, which proves that alterations in supply and demand cannot produce a general rise or fall of values, though they may cause a rise or fall in the value of a particular thing, is as applicable to labor. What conceals the absurdity of speaking generally of supply and demand in reference to labor is the habit of considering the demand for labor as springing from capital and as something distinct from labor. But the analysis to which this idea has been heretofore subjected has sufficiently shown its fallacy. It is indeed evident from the mere statement that wages can never permanently exceed the produce of labor, and hence there is no fund from which wages can for any time be drawn, save that which labor constantly creates. All right. I kind of, I confess, I zoned out a little bit there. Um, Paid more attention towards the end. Yes, the old wages do not come from capital. Yes, this connection between supply and demand. I'm gonna go back up. Uh, it is commonly said the general rate of wages is determined by supply and demand. The words are meaningless. Excuse me. Demand, yeah, for supply and demand, but relative, the supply of labor can only mean labor offered in exchange for labor, or the produce of labor. And the demand for labor can only mean labor or the produce of labor offered in exchange for labor. Oh, I see. When you're saying supply and demand, you're not. Oh, this is. So he's talking about the supply of labor and the demand for labor. I was getting confused because I hear supply and demand. I just immediately think of the supply and demand of a particular good, which is going to be a little bit different than the supply and demand for labor in a general sense. I see. Uh, yes. All right. See you next time. Bye bye.